the threat of a default on our sovereign debt. This measure takes that threat off the table. It assures credit markets that their investments in the United States are as certain as anything that can be had in this life. Mr. Speaker, let us pass this rule and proceed with consideration of the bill.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentlelady from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, the ranking member on Ways and Means, Mr. Levin.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 3 minutes.
Ask unanimous consent to revise and extend.
Without objection.
You know, when you boil this all down, essentially what this bill says is pay some bills first and not others. I came here because if the rule passes, we'll have a full discussion tomorrow, but I wanted to share with everybody the story that I saw this morning. It's accurate. The headline is, John Boehner on debt ceiling, let's pay China first, then U.S. troops. That headline in HuffPost is based on an interview of the speaker with Bloomberg TV, Peter Cook. And I quote, Mr. Cook, doesn't it mean, as Democrats have suggested, that you're basically choosing to pay China before you pay U.S. troops? The speaker, in quotes, listen, those who have loaned us money, like in any other proceeding, if you will, court proceeding, the bondholders usually get paid first. Same thing here. Same thing here, end of quote. And then the speaker says, to conclude his comments, as to the administration, if it comes to the point where they don't have enough money to pay the bills, here is some order that we think is sound. End of quotes. It's not sound. As the SAP says, it's not workable. It endangers our economy. I quote Keith Hennessy, a former Bush administration economist. It would be the first step, I quote, to becoming a banana republic, end of quotes. In quotes, a bloody mess, end of quotes. As mentioned earlier by our distinguished ranking member on the rules, another Bush administration official, Tony Fratto, said, I quote, prioritization is impossible. Is the government really going to be in the position of withholding benefits, salaries, rent, contract payments in order to pay off Treasury bondholders? Almost half, by the way, are held by foreigners. So it isn't sound also to choose some over others. And so I just want to go through the list, if I might, so everybody understands essentially what this is saying. China and other bondholders first, not American troops in harm's way. China first, not retired and disabled veterans. I ask for additional time, if I might.
I yield the gentleman an additional minute.
Gentleman from Michigan is recognized for a minute.
China first, not doctors and hospitals treating Medicare patients. China first, not American small businesses who provide goods and services. China and others first, not school lunch programs. China and others first, not universities doing medical research. China and other bondholders first, not college students who earn Pell Grants, or taxpayers do refunds, or other federal trust funds holding Treasury bonds. For example, Medicare trust funds, deposit insurance, highway and airport trust funds, and the Federal Housing Authority. In a word, this is irresponsible. Default is default is default. The Republicans are playing with fire, I think, to gain political leverage. Instead, they should think of the national interest. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Michigan yields back. Gentlelady from New York reserves. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. We've had an opportunity once again today, as we did yesterday, to hear from the ranking member of the Ways and Means Committee, the gentleman from Michigan. And he brought his ideas, the best ideas he had, up to the Rules Committee yesterday on this same issue. But the issues that the gentleman speaks about are attacking our answers. Their answer that they propose is tax increases and spending increases, and that way we'll simply have more money into the system. Because as you've already heard today, just a few minutes ago, the more money we give in unemployment compensation, the more vitality is in our cities, more spending takes place. More unemployment compensation, more vitality, more spending in our cities. Mr. Speaker, that's the wrong way to go. The Republican Party does not believe that we should create a permanent underclass of people who receive unemployment compensation or who are afraid of facing the truth about where this country's headed. The facts of the case are other countries are ahead of us on this curve. Most of them are in Europe, and they ignored the signs that Republicans are here talking about today, the signs of spending too much, relying on its people to raise taxes for them to bring money in, and a big government continuing to put rules and regulations and impediments in front of people. The facts of the case are simple. We are here today because it is President Obama and the Democrats who spent too much money, who are destroying jobs, and who even today are holding back the Keystone Pipeline, what could be thousands of jobs for people in this country, lessen our reliance on other parts of the world for our energy, and bring back American-made jobs. This is exactly why we're having problems. So it's the Republican Party that is trying to offer a public discussion, a public debate, including our great speaker, John Boehner, who says we need to make sure that part of the debate comes down to if we get to that point, that we pay back the people who loaned us money in the first place, because they need to have confidence that they can continue loaning us money because we're still having to borrow a lot of money. I can think of few things that would be worse than to publicly announce we're going to pay somebody else before we pay back our creditors. That is how creditors no longer borrow any money to you. So what Republicans are doing is having a public debate. We're bringing this to the floor. And I do recognize our friends on the other side, our Democrat friends, that they want to spend more and tax more. And they've never seen enough spending in this place. They want more and more. They're like our president. They have an insatiable appetite to spend people's money. And then, like literally, somebody who started a fire as an arsonist show up as the firefighter, the hero, to say, but I want to save our country. They created the economic malaise that we have. It is overspending. It's holding back job creation. And Republicans are going to stand on the floor and have this debate with the media and the American people and the administration and say, let's know what we're going to do when we get there months ahead of time so that we don't falter like we did some time ago and take on the president's idea again of sequestration, only to have him argue against his own idea later and then try and mislead the American public what this whole issue is about. It's about economic demise of the United States of America and how we are having to work here to make sure that we publicly discuss this before it becomes too late. I yield back the balance of my time. I reserve my time. Excuse me.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentlelady from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from California, one of our impressive freshmen, Mr. Huffman.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Request unanimous consent to revise and extend my...
Gentleman's recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise to oppose the impossibly misnamed Full Faith and Credit Act, a bill which would actually make a mockery of our country's full faith and credit. It prepares our country for default by prioritizing payments to Wall Street and foreign governments over nearly every other national obligation. Now, we've seen the disastrous effects on our credit rating, our stock market, our economic recovery when Congress plays political games with the debt ceiling. But here we go again. Why would my colleagues across the aisle prioritize paying the Chinese government over paying our troops in Afghanistan? What about air traffic controllers, FBI investigators, disabled veterans, small businesses who contract with the government, doctors who treat Medicare patients? This bill says it's okay to stiff all of them, as long as Chinese bondholders are paid in full. Mr. Speaker, it's time to move forward with House-Senate negotiations on a final budget resolution that strengthens the economy and avoids default. That's what we've been asking Speaker Boehner to do. But instead of taking that responsible step, we're here today considering a bill that would take us closer to the brink of economic chaos. For the sake of American workers and businesses, I urge my colleagues to reject this dangerous bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back his time. The gentlelady from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California.
The gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding once again. The dominant theme from our friends on the other side seems to be China first. This pays China first. That's the constant refrain we're hearing. Let me again remind them, China holds about 10% of our debt. Americans hold more than half of it. And all of our spending from this government depends on maintaining our credit. That means whoever is loaning us money, whether China or Timbuktu, whether it's the Teamsters Pension Fund or a child's savings bond that they've gotten for their birthday, we are borrowing over a quarter of everything that we spend. And if we cannot borrow, if the confidence of the credit markets is ever compromised, this whole house of cards collapses around us. A house of cards constructed by this administration's profligate borrowing. Our credit is now bearing a greater burden and strain than it has ever borne before. All this measure suggests is that we should at least reinforce that credit with exactly the same guarantees that most of our states have successfully employed for generations, and that I would remind my friend from California, California has had in its Constitution for over 100 years. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cooper.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for a minute and a half.
Excuse me, let me make that 2 minutes, if I may.
Pass unanimous
Thank
consent to revise and extend my remarks.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm opposed to the rule, and I'm opposed to the Pay China First bill. But it's my understanding that they've added something, I think it's called the Camp Amendment, that would make sure that members of Congress are not paid if the nation, in fact, defaults. This borrows an idea that I introduced back in the summer of 2011, H.R. 2653, and we had a number of bipartisan co-sponsors. I'm worried, though, that despite imitation being the sincerest form of flattery, they've diluted this concept to make it unconstitutional. Due to the 27th Amendment, it is unconstitutional to adjust member pay during a session. We had it drafted so that members would be paid last, which would pretty much ensure that we would not be paid. And perhaps they've corrected the drafting on their side, but they've also done this to me once before this year. They took our no budget, no pay idea that the No Labels group had sponsored, and it's now become law. But they took out the heart of it. Right now, we should be having a House-Senate conference, since both houses have finally passed legislation, the Senate being the laggard. Now, after 4 years, they finally passed a budget. But now we're refusing to conference the budget. So I'm a believer in pay for performance. The American taxpayer is not getting their money's worth from today's Congress. They should be getting their money's worth, and I think these concepts about penalizing Congress when we fail to do our job are very powerful concepts, but they should be given full strength, not diluted and unconstitutional treatment in a quickie amendment such as is being offered here. But the core of idea, pay for performance, I hope that more of my colleagues will look at it, because Congress does many things right, and we should be rewarded for that. We fail many ways, and we should be penalized for that. Today, sadly, the only people in America who are not able to pay Congress by performance are the taxpayers, because special interests are paying us by performance all the time, whether in PAC contributions or post-retirement job opportunities. That is one reason this Congress is not performing to full capability. It's one reason we're not living up to our potential. So as we look at this concept, this Camp Amendment, please let's do it right. Please let's make sure that Congress is not paid for failure. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from New York reserved. Gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I yield myself 2 minutes.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I want to acknowledge, in fact, what Mr. Cooper's presence here today. His idea was valid and, in fact, was utilized in what we have done. The slight difference of how I'd like to describe this gentleman is we did not say that members cannot be paid. What we said is that no new debt can be used to pay members. So we would have to be paid out of, if we're spending 40% too much money today and 60% was coming in, we could be paid out of that amount. But we could not be paid out of the debt side amount, which is what this legislation is germane and what this legislation is about. So I do thank the gentleman. I thank the gentleman for his ideas that members of Congress should equally suffer or equally gain as the American people have. In this circumstance, it's the loss for all of us. And that is why Chairman Kemp included this as an amendment to make sure that we clarified members of Congress could not be paid with new debt that was being brought to the United States as part of this bill. So I hope that clarifies not only the success that we believe that Mr. Cooper brought with his ideas, but also the intent of what this legislation actually does, what we spoke about in the Rules Committee, and the fine line between paying a member and whether it comes from new debt or whether it comes from operating entities that would be within the 60% that would not be the new debt. So I hope this clarifies not only what we're trying to do, but that we speak forthrightly to members about what this legislation actually is. I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Article 1, Section 8, 8.1, the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. Now, Amendment 14 says, Section 4, the validity of the public debt of the United States, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services, shall not be questioned. But that's precisely what the Republican Party, the Republican majority, is doing today. And I have many friends on the Republican side of the aisle who I respect, but I've never been as disappointed in them as I am today. Pari passu, that means equal. The United States of America for 235 years has treated all its creditors equally. If you're the landlord, if you get a salary, if you mow the lawn on the National Mall, you get paid at the same time that somebody who loans money to the United States gets paid. Everybody gets paid. That's how we treat it. We don't treat it that China or Wall Street or Saudi Arabia, because they've loaned us money, gets paid before the nurse working in one of our VA hospitals. That's not America. That is wrong. That is not how we run our country. It is unconstitutional. And I'd say to my friends, this short little bill of yours to prioritize our debts is exactly the wrong thing to do. If I were a credit rating agency, I'd say if you're prioritizing your debts, you're getting ready to not pay somebody, and everybody's treated equally. So I would say, if I were that credit rating agency, I would downgrade us today. I would say to my, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd say to my friends on the Republican side of the aisle, to the majority party, don't do this. This is wrong. This is not our nation. We have built this nation on equality, and that includes the equality of payment. Whether you're a landlord or you work for the country, you're a veteran, whatever it may be, you get paid. That's how we operate it. And we in this Congress have the ability not only to raise the revenue that's needed to do that, but manage our expenses. But we don't stiff anybody. And so I'd say to my friends, withdraw this bill now. It is bad legislation. It is wrong for this nation. Get rid of it. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from New York reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I'd like to yield 5 minutes to the Chairman of the Financial Services Committee, the member from the 5th District of Texas, the gentleman from Dallas, Texas, Mr. Hensterling.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I thank the distinguished Chairman of the Rules Committee for yielding, Mr. Speaker, and I also want to thank the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, who has been perhaps the most cogent defender of the Constitution on the floor of the United States House of Representatives, and who has provided his leadership today to ensure that we do not have default on sovereign debt, but we put this nation on a path to fiscal sanity, and I thank him for his leadership. Mr. Speaker, the folks in the 5th Congressional District of Texas that I'm proud to represent, they have a lot of insecurity about their personal economy, and they have great fear that their children will not enjoy a brighter future. And I heard my friend, the gentleman from Colorado, say that everyone gets paid. Well, Mr. Speaker, maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe that is one of the reasons why under President Obama's leadership there has been more debt created in the last 4 years than in our nation's first 200. We are awash in debt. And, Mr. Speaker, we know that we have a debt not because we have insufficient taxes, but because we spend too much. Math is a pesky thing. In the last 10 years, the Department of Ag up 114%. HUD up 61%, HHS 79%. Our total government spending has increased 70%, and the family budget, measured by median family income, the family budget, which has to pay for the federal budget, down 6%. Now, some have said, well, you know, revenues are a problem. Well, revenues are up 52%, but you can't raise taxes enough to chase the spending that the Democrats and the President want to foist upon the American people. They have put us on a path to national bankruptcy. At some point, we've got to quit spending money we don't have. Again, we are on the precipice of a debt crisis, and we have it because of too much spending. Now, some of my friends on the other side of the aisle, their answer to the debt ceiling is to get rid of it. Some have introduced legislation just to get rid of the debt ceiling. You know, that's kind of, Mr. Speaker, like a fire breaks out in your home and your response is to unplug the smoke detector because of that nuisance noise in the background that maybe your house is on fire. And I would remind my friends on the other side of the aisle, Greece didn't have a debt ceiling vote, and yet we have Democrats who say, nope, let's just get rid of it. But for those who believe that we're not going to get rid of it, we have other friends from across the aisle who essentially want to use it as a hostage for something that is not a debt. A debt is when you go out and you borrow money and you must pay it back. Every family understands this. It's one thing for an American family to borrow money to pay their mortgage versus borrowing money so that they can pay for a Las Vegas vacation that they would like to take. They are not equivalent. Mr. Speaker, paying sovereign debt is not the same thing as borrowing money so that this institution and this town can continue to spend money for pottery classes in Morocco, to pay for the travel expenses of the Alabama watermelon queen, to pay for robotic squirrels and all the rest of the lunacy that this federal government spends and takes bread off the table of hard-working American families. Now, Mr. Speaker, we believe that the President has this power, but he says, oh, no, I don't have this power. And so I find it ironic that we're willing to codify what we already believe to be the law of the land, and the President says, no, I want to veto that. Again, he wants to use this as a hostage. This is a very simple bill introduced by the gentleman from California to require our Treasury to make good on all of our debt payments. That's it. We must stop borrowing money to squander our children's future. This bill will help us do this. But the Democrats, they don't want to take this specter of default off the table. It's the only way. It's the only way they can continue spending. Now, they say they do, and if they do, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to seeing their name up on the big board soon. This is the right thing and the smart thing to do, and I urge the House adopt this rule and adopt the bill.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions, reserves. The gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, let me yield myself 30 seconds just to talk about what it is we're trying to pay for on our side. 1.4 million active duty troops, 780,000 troops in reserves who will not be paid while China is. Benefits to 3.4 million disabled veterans, 1.3 million veterans receiving education or home purchasing assistance. Earned payments to the American small business, payments to 1.1 million doctors and healthcare practitioners who provide care to seniors with Medicare, payments to schools and nutritious lunches served to 32 million children, payments to 44,000 National Institutes of Health guarantees, and I am pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler.
Gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentlelady from yielding, Mr. Speaker. This bill would raise the debt ceiling, but only insofar as necessary and only for the purpose of paying our debts to China and to Social Security. Not raising the debt ceiling beyond what this bill does would mandate not paying Medicare beneficiaries or our troops overseas or our veterans here at home or anyone owed money for working for the federal government, and would generally collapse the economy by forcing default on most of our debts. Raising the debt ceiling merely allows us to pay debts we have previously incurred, all debts previously incurred. We should recognize this simple reality by eliminating the debt ceiling and passing responsible budgets. But Republicans now use the debt ceiling to hold the entire country hostage unless their demands, which they haven't figured out what they are yet, but unless their demands are met. This reminds me of a 1930s gangster film. It's a nice restaurant you got over there. It's a nice economy you got over there. Pity if it should happen to blow up if you don't meet our demands. This Republican tactic has already brought about the first downgrade in the U.S. credit rating in history and has brought about brutal spending cuts that have punished the middle class, failed to help the millions of Americans looking for work, and weakened the safety net for working families and seniors. Mr. Speaker, it was 2 wars and 2 Bush tax cuts and 8 years of irresponsibility that brought us a deficit in the last budget adopted under George Bush of 10.1%. We have reduced of GDP. We have reduced that budget deficit in 3 years from 10.1% of GDP to 4.8% today. This is the fastest deficit reduction since the demobilization after World War II. Economists agree that the draconian austerity decreed by the sequester is slowing our economic growth, eliminating millions of jobs, and could create a double-dip recession. We have seen this in Europe. We're starting 2.5 years ago, they adopted the policies that the Republicans want. They adopted severe austerity. They cut budgets too much. And the result is a double-dip depression, where they're at negative economic growth. We're still at positive economic growth. We're hearing from our Republican friends today about how endangered our credit rating is. Our credit rating is so endangered despite their frightening rhetoric, that we are paying the lowest interest rates on our bonds ever, and our bonds are selling higher. People are getting in line to buy our bonds because our credit rating is in fact quite good. Yet in spite of presenting the American people with a plan to invest in our economy and create jobs for the 12 million Americans looking for work, Republicans are once again intent on manufacturing a crisis that will only increase unemployment. We should not develop a plan for how to generate and then manage a devastating default that will put our economy into chaos. We should repeal the sequester, slow down our deficit reduction, spend the money on highways and bridges and infrastructure investing and putting our people back to work so that more people work, unemployment goes down, government spending and unemployment insurance and food stamps goes down, and the economy improves and our unemployment also goes down. That's the proper path, which what the Republicans are trying to do would say, don't do that, follow the path of Europe, get 12 or 15% unemployment. That's what this bill would head us in the direction of doing. That's not the direction we ought to be going in. We ought to safeguard our credit and not even contemplate the possibility of default. I thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from New York has 7.5 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions, has 4 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Cardenas.
Thank you, Mr.
There you are.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam. Today I rise in opposition to House Resolutions 202 and House Resolutions 807 because the last time Congress did something this dumb, it cost the American public $19 billion over the next 10 years. Why? Because our credit rating was downgraded for the first time in the history of the United States. Let's not do something like that again. That does not help the economy. It doesn't put anyone to work. All it does is make sure that everybody around the world who loves to buy American-backed paper just gets more money for it, which means more money out of the pockets of Americans for one reason and one reason only, to have the optics of politics of a bill like this that actually basically states we are not going to back the paper that people buy. That is something that is not within our American values. That's something that doesn't even need to see the light of day. And it's a shame that we would play politics with the American dollar. We would play politics with the reputation of this great country by having these two bills before us. Thank you. I yield my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from New York reserves. Gentleman from Texas.
I reserve my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire if my colleague has any more requests for time?
Except for my final close, I do not, and I thank the gentlewoman.
Thank you. Let me introduce the previous question. Mr. Speaker, if we can defeat the previous question, I will offer an amendment to the rule that will allow the House to hold a vote on the Student Loan Relief Act. If Congress doesn't act, next month undergraduate students across the country will see a hike in their student loan interest rates. If my Republican colleagues want to talk about debt priorities, this should be a part of the dialogue. To discuss the proposal, I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney.
The gentleman from Connecticut is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the previous question, and as the gentlelady said, defeat of the previous question will allow her to propose instead an amendment to the rule to a bill that intentionally degrades the full faith and credit of our country, sets that aside, and instead allows for consideration for the Student Loan Relief Act, a measure which will prevent the subsidized Stafford Student Loan Program from doubling in 53 days. Let me again reiterate that point. On July 1st, if Congress does not act, the subsidized Stafford Student Loan Program, which provides student loan assistance for over 7 million young Americans, will double from 3.4% to 6.8%. We have heard a lot of talk on the floor here today about debt and about trying to protect the young people of this country. Well, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York recently issued its latest update regarding student loan debt in this country, which is now $1.1 trillion. It's higher than credit card debt. It is higher than car loan debt. When we talk about the challenges facing particularly young people in this country who are trying to get the opportunity to upgrade their skills, something which this recession has taught us painfully is necessary, because the unemployment rate of people with high school degrees or less is 3 times as high as people with 4-year degrees. The fact of the matter is the subsidized Stafford student loan program is a lifeline in terms of young people being able to pay the rising cost of tuition. Despite the fact that we have a ticking clock of 53 days and only 24 session days scheduled between now and July 1st, the majority has not brought a single proposal forward to avoid this catastrophe from happening to young people all across the country. The Student Loan Relief Act, which I am the lead co-sponsor of, has over 125 co-sponsors here in the House, will extend the lower rate for 2 years and will allow this chamber to once and for all get its arms around this serious, critical problem for the future of this country. The fact of the matter is the student loan debt issue requires a comprehensive rewrite of the Higher Education Authorization Act, which will give tools to young people starting in high school to make better choices about where they go to school, how they're going to pay for it, with better awareness and information. It would also allow people who have graduated to be able to refinance their debt so that they can lower those monthly payments. Again, you talk to the realtors in this country about what's holding back the housing market. Young people in their 20s and 30s who are carrying student loan debt of $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 are not in a position to go out and buy a house because they can't qualify for a mortgage because of these high payments. It is time for Congress to focus on what people are really waking up in the morning thinking about and worrying about, which is how to pay for college. Mr. Speaker, on May 1st, we just celebrated Decision Day, which is the day when young people make the choice about where they're going to college. Unfortunately, they have no clue about whether or not their subsidized Stafford loan rate, which has been in place for the last 6 years, is going to continue beyond July 1st. It is time for this chamber to focus on what's important to American families. Let's take up the Student Loan Relief Act. Let's pass a higher education authorization bill which deals with this issue from soup to nuts, and let's set aside this crazy bill which intentionally degrades the full faith and credit of our country. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Connecticut yields back. Gentlelady from New York reserves.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to continue my closing, if I may. I think
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you very much. And the fact that this chamber has dedicated valuable time and resources consideration of an unconstitutional bill that will put our nation on the road to default is regretful. The fact the legislation puts the economic interest of China before paying our soldiers' salaries and providing benefits to our veterans is a disgrace. The plan presented by the majority fails to raise the debt ceiling, which is the only way that we can prevent economic default. Instead, it simply wastes another week of valuable time and $24 million it costs to run this House or Congress for a week, and moves us that much closer to yet another downgrade in our nation's credit rating, something that had never happened until the majority assumed control of the House. And now it is actually possible the majority would lead us to the second downgrade of the nation's credit over the course of 2 short years. On May 19th, our nation will reach its debt ceiling, and emergency measures will be put into place to delay default. We've seen this film before, and we know how the movie ends, a twisted plot with terrible consequences that come by refusing to pay our bills. I urge my colleagues not to walk down that road again, and, Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of the amendment in the record along with extraneous material immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.
Without objection.
And, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues most enthusiastically to vote no. To defeat the previous question, I urge a no vote on the rule. I would like to see this bill withdrawn, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady from New York yields back her time. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. You know, Speaker, I've been around this place a long time, and I've heard of people who did not read bills. I've heard of people that did not understand bills. But I've never seen a circumstance today where the truth was being held hostage. The facts of the case are very simple. Republicans today are offering a mechanism to the President of the United States and the American people that says, if we do get in a circumstance where we do not extend our debt to further allow the federal government to buy more debt to pay its obligations, then we offer this opportunity, and that is that the government can, even when we're in a circumstance where we cannot borrow more money, and let's say we spend 60% that we get money in, but 40% is the debt that we can no longer have available to pay our obligations, about a 60-40 split, then we're allowing the federal government to go borrow more debt to pay its obligations so that it doesn't compete against the money that does come in to pay the bills of the United States as the President of the United States would choose. I've never heard of a more reasonable option. We're not telling the President how to spend the money. We're giving authorization for new debt to pay our debt obligations. That's not cutting people off. It's not truthful to say we're going to do that. Anybody that tells you that didn't read the bill. What this is about is to say, if we go into a debt circumstance where we cannot come to an agreement, then we are authorizing the federal government, the Treasury, to go get more debt, only enough to pay debt obligations to where we do not default. And then we work on the circumstances of how much money comes in. This has been miscast. The truth has been held hostage. And I am disappointed in members of Congress who came down here and misled the American people about what this bill is. It is nothing more than allowing the Treasury to go borrow money to pay its already obligations to people who loaned us money. It says nothing about how they will pay normal bills to people. And to come to this floor and suggest this is simply a disservice to the obligations I think that we have to be open and honest about what our job is. I urge my colleagues to understand the simplification of what this bill is about, to not try and twist it, to have it become something it is not. I hope my colleagues will vote yes on the rule, yes on the underlying legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time, and I move the previous question on the resolution.
The gentleman from Texas yields back his time. The question is on ordering the previous question on the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I request the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question are postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend the remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 1406.
Without objection. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, we're bringing up H.R. 1406, the Working Families Flexibility Act.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
Union Calendar Number 30, H.R. 1406, a bill to amend the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 to provide compensatory time for employees in the private sector.
Pursuant to House Resolution 198, the amendment recommended by the Committee on Education and the Workforce printed in the bill is adopted. The bill as amended is considered as read. After 1 hour of debate on the bill as amended, it shall be ordered to consider the further amendment printed in House Report 113-51 if offered by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Gibson, or his designee, which shall be considered read and shall be separately debatable for 10 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent. The gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Klein, and the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of H.R. 1406, the Working Families Flexibility Act of 2013, and yield myself such time as I may consume. Today we have an opportunity to make life a little easier for working families across the country. This legislation doesn't create a new government program or bureaucracy. It doesn't spend taxpayer dollars or add to the national debt. The Working Families Flexibility Act simply removes an outdated federal policy that denies private sector workers the flexibility they need to better balance family and work. For 75 years, the Fair Labor Standards Act has provided covered workers with basic wage and hour protections. Those covered by the law receive time and a half in paid compensation for each overtime hour worked. The law plays a significant role in millions of workplaces, yet it does not reflect the realities of the modern workforce. For example, in 2011, 59% of families with children had 2 working parents compared to 37% 40 years ago. Meanwhile, 8.5 million workers today are single parents, and 1 in 3 undergraduate students also works full-time. Behind each statistic, Mr. Speaker, are men and women trying to juggle family and work. A single working mom that needs extra time to attend a parent-teacher conference, a dad hoping to leave work early to catch his son's Little League game, a married couple working 2 jobs while raising a family and caring for an aging relative. Supporting a family is about more than providing an income. It's about being there for one another. We know there are a lot of workers who would seize the opportunity to earn a few extra dollars, but others may welcome additional paid time off to spend with loved ones. Shouldn't workers choose what's best for their families? Shouldn't workers choose? Unfortunately, federal law denies many private sector workers this fundamental choice. The law assumes everyone would choose more money in the bank over more time with family. To add insult to injury, public sector employees have enjoyed this benefit for decades, yet we continue to treat those in the private sector differently. That's not fair, Mr. Speaker. It's not fair to millions of hardworking Americans. The Working Families Flexibility Act will remove this unnecessary barrier and allow private sector employers to offer employees the choice to accrue paid time off or comp time for working overtime. The bill does not change the 40-hour work week, and comp time would accrue at the same time-and-a-half rate as cash wages. The legislation includes numerous protections to ensure the use of comp time is strictly, Mr. Speaker, voluntary, such as requiring a written agreement between the employer and employee, allowing workers to cash out their accrued comp time whenever they choose, retaining all enforcement remedies available under current law, and adding new protections to prevent coercion and intimidation. At the heart of the legislation is worker choice. Workers choose whether to accept comp time. Workers choose when to cash out their accrued comp time, and workers choose when to use their paid time off so long as they follow the same standard public sector employees do. The same standard, Mr. Speaker. Americans sacrifice a lot to provide for their families. Let's get the federal government out of the way and give workers the flexibility they need to thrive at home and at work. I urge my colleagues to support the Working Families Flexibility Act of 2013, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Minnesota reserves his time. The gentleman from Connecticut is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to this legislation, which, again, is no stranger, sadly, to this Congress. This is the 5th time that the majority party has introduced it, going back to 1997, and each time the huge flaws in this legislation has resulted in its complete collapse in terms of getting anything close to real support through both chambers and through the executive branch. And once again, it doesn't deserve that support in this case. Despite the representations made in its title that it promotes workers' flexibility, that it gives workers choice, the fact of the matter is a closer examination of the bill shows the opposite is true. The better way to describe this bill is the more work, pay less bill, because what it does is it takes the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act, which created a bright line to protect people's right to a 40-hour work week, and make sure that that next hour after 40 hours is paid for with a time and a half of wages. And again, that created the weekend in America. That created the time off that families have taken for granted as middle-class Americans for decades. What this bill does is it blurs that line. It creates total chaos in terms of trying to come up with a system to set up ground rules with a case-by-case contract, written contract that's mandated by the language of the bill, and then leaves it to the enforcement of state labor departments, wage and hours divisions, which are totally incapable of going into the tens of thousands of workplaces all across America and trying to figure out whether or not, in fact, the rules have been followed. A closer examination of the bill shows on page 8 of the bill in lines 7 through 10 that in fact all these representations that the worker gets to choose are in fact not correct. At the end of the day, the employer has the right to veto any comp time that this bill has allowed to accrue over any period of time. So the notion that somehow a person has that choice to accumulate comp time and then be able to use it for a family vacation or a family emergency in fact does not meet the actual plain language of the bill that is before us today. And that is why organizations which represent working families, organizations which represent women, organizations which have been part of employment law for years and years and years in this country have resoundingly come out in opposition to this legislation. Over 160 various organizations of every stripe representing religious groups, women's groups, labor groups, groups that, again, deal with employment law, have basically looked at this legislation for the 5th time and given it thumbs down. The fact is we should do that. There is no question, however, that workers do, in fact, need more help in terms of making sure that the wages that have stagnated over the last 3 decades get more support, that families who, again, are strained by the fact that those stagnating wages have required second jobs and multiple spouses in the workforce. But the fact is there are much better solutions than this legislation, the More Work, Pay Less Act. In fact, what we should do is set up a standard for paid sick leave in this country so that a single parent waking up with a child whose temperature is over 100 degrees doesn't feel that they have no choice in terms of how to deal with that situation, that they have some guaranteed opportunity without losing the pay that they need to put food on the table or put gas in the tank, that they in fact have that choice, which so many of us here as members of Congress and our staff certainly take for granted. We should apply the same standards in terms of sick pay that we enjoy to the working people of this country. This bill doesn't do it. This bill does not meet that test. Again, it sets up a system that is completely unworkable and unenforceable. It butchers the Fair Labor Standard Act's bright line that has protected the American weekend for decades and decades in this country, and in the name of workplace flexibility, in fact, tips the scales of power within the American workforce once again against the worker, against the employee, who basically for far too long has suffered in this economy. We need better solutions. This is not the bill, and I would, again, reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney, reserves his time. Gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very, very pleased right now to yield to the author of this terrific piece of legislation, a member of the committee, the gentlelady from Alabama, Mrs. Roby. 3 minutes.
The gentlelady from Alabama is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the Working Family Flexibility Act of 2013. I thank the gentleman from Minnesota, my chairman, for all of the hard work on this bill and the committee as well. Mr. Speaker, I am proud to sponsor this bill, and I can tell you as a working mom, my husband Riley and I, we certainly relate to and understand the pulls on families that are juggling so much between their work life and their home life. And if you talk to any working mom or dad, you'll hear them say things like, you know, wouldn't it be nice to have flexibility to attend my son's soccer game, coach a t-ball team, take care of my aging parent, be there to support my children at a time when one of the spouses is being deployed by our military. These are things, all things that working moms and dads want to be a part of, that those that have elderly parents want to be there for their parents in the time of need. We can't legislate another hour in the workday, but we sure can give moms and dads a little bit of relief when it comes to flexibility in their workplace. Under this bill, no worker could ever be forced, despite the claims of my colleagues on the other side, no worker could ever be forced to take time off, paid time off, just like no business would ever be forced to offer it. For some people, having paid time off is far more valuable than money. The problem is, Mr. Speaker, that under the current law, the private sector doesn't enjoy the same privilege to offer this benefit to their workers as the public sector does. And as my colleague just was talking about sick time, sick leave, and the benefits that we may enjoy in the federal government, I think that the private sector should enjoy the benefit that federal employees have now, and that's compensatory time and the right to choose what to do with their time. Our message to Americans, Mr. Speaker, is very clear. We must get Washington out of the way of how they use their time. It is your time to choose. All existing enforcement remedies under the current law are retained, but this legislation goes above and beyond to incorporate additional protections that will prevent coercion and ensure utilizing comp time is truly voluntary, including a requirement of a written agreement, a voluntary written agreement between the employer and the employee, a cash-out provision entitling the employee to ask for their paid overtime at any time, and a provision requiring employers to be found in violation of a coercion to pay double damages. I want to read, I have lots of quotes from constituents, but one in particular that sums all of this up. I got a note from a young lady who lives a long way from Alabama's 2nd Congressional District in California, and she said, she wrote to us, as a kid growing up with both parents who worked, I missed a lot of time with them. I'm also an only child, so I didn't really spend time with my actual family. I was either in the daycare or a friend's house during the 5-day work week. And if my mom took time off, she wouldn't get paid over that time period.
Additional minute. Gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I didn't really spend time with my actual family. I was either in daycare or a friend's house during the 5-day work week. And if my mom took time off, she wouldn't get paid over that time period, even though she would work overtime. So when I read about this bill, I was touched and compelled to tell you, if this bill passes, it really would change people's lives and help families around America. Thank you for recognizing how valuable time is to people and for giving us an option of how how to use our time. I thought that was compelling, and Mr. Speaker, I think that sums up this bill in its entirety. This doesn't solve our nation's debt problems or our deficit, but this provides some relief to working families in America, to those working moms and dads. I urge my colleagues to support this bill. I yield back.
The gentlelady from Alabama yields back. The gentleman from Connecticut is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's my privilege now to yield to the minority whip, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, for 2 minutes.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for